There is a specific breed of individual for whom a machine is not simply a collection of gears, pistons and fuel. It is something far more profounder, chrome-plated extension of the spirit, a sacred object that demands reverence. To admire it is expected. To touch it without permission is a transgression. But to attempt to take it, that is an invitation to a catastrophe that few can predict. In March 2020, the world was descending into a singular, collective anxiety. As nations locked their doors and citizens panicked over basic supplies, a very different kind of tension was coiling like a spring in the quiet town of Greenhithe, Kent. This is an area typically defined by its proximity to massive retail centers, not by the kind of kinetic, high-stakes confrontations usually reserved for cinema screens. Yet, inside a residence on Cooper Close, the silence of the impending lockdown was about to be shattered. Living at the center of this unfolding drama was Colin Norse, a 38-year-old man who, by all accounts, lived a structured, industrious life. He was joined by his older brother, Christopher, who had come to visit. On the surface, they were merely two enthusiasts, enjoying a quiet evening, perhaps discussing the finer points of torque and horsepower. But beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy, the Norse brothers possessed a mindset that set them apart from their neighbors. They were not merely hobbyists, they were tacticians. Recent history placed the brothers not on the rainy streets of England, but in the arid, sun-bleached ranges of Texas. They hadn't spent their holidays lounging by a pool, they had spent them perfecting their aim. They were students of ballistics, spending days learning the precise art of target acquisition and controlled breathing. When they returned to the UK, they didn't leave that intensity at the border. They brought it home, waiting for a moment that would justify its use. That moment arrived under the cover of darkness. A group of aspiring entrepreneurs individuals, who viewed the Norse brothers' collection of high-performance Ducatis and Yamahas as inventory for their own illicit business, descended on the property. In a standard scenario, the homeowner peers through the curtains, feels a surge of panic, and immediately dials emergency services. They wait, hope and pray that the sirens arrive before the property disappears. But Christopher and Colin Norse were not standard homeowners. When the initial commotion began, alerted, perhaps by a neighbor, or the subtle sounds of metal on metal, they did not reach for a phone. They did not shout warnings into the night to scare off the intruders. Instead, a chilling calm settled over the residence. The brothers retreated into the house, not to hide but to prepare. They began a process of logistical assembly that resembled a military operation more than a domestic response. This was not a panic-induced scramble. It was a cold, calculated transition from victim to operator. As the thieves outside worked on the bike locks, unaware of the shift in the atmosphere, they were no longer just criminals committing a property crime. They were unknowingly stepping into a meticulously laid trap, about to face a level of resistance that would turn a communal car park into an arena of severe consequences. The brothers were suiting up, and they were bringing the Texas philosophy of defense to the quiet streets of Kent. To understand the gravity of the collision that was about to occur, one must first understand the force moving against the Norse brothers. The group targeting the motorcycles was not merely a collection of misguided youths looking for a joyride. Leading the charge was Ross Eaglestone, a man whose history suggested a temperament incompatible with peaceful society. To label Eaglestone simply as a thief would be a profound minimization of his career. It would be like calling an apex predator a pet. At 31 years old, he was a veteran of the Maidstone Crown Court, a man whose previous actions painted a picture of someone comfortable with severe aggression. Eaglestone's criminal resume was extensive, marked not by petty theft, but by moments of extreme volatility. His past included a disturbing incident involving a pair of household scissors used as a weapon during a neighborhood gathering, resulting in a grave injury to another man. In another instance, his capacity for violence was directed at a female victim, delivering a blow with such intensity that it shattered her orbital socket and caused significant internal trauma. Perhaps most chilling was his attempt to manipulate the course of justice by issuing a terminal threat against a 7-year-old child to silence a witness. This was the caliber of individual creeping toward the Norse residency, a man who had spent his adult life demonstrating a complete disregard for the well-being of others. However, Eaglestone and his associates had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed the occupants of the house in Greenhithe would respond with the typical hesitation of law-abiding citizens. They expected locked doors, frightened whispers, and a desperate call to the authorities. Instead, they were about to encounter a response that defied all standard protocols of home defense. Inside the property, Christopher and Colin Norse were not cowering. They were engaging in a calm, methodical preparation that transformed their domestic space into a tactical staging ground. The brothers did not reach for a phone. They reached for a specialized inventory. The primary instrument of the evening was a 9mm handgunner device, designed not to warn, but to neutralize. This was not a toy for enthusiasts. It was a serious piece of ballistic engineering, capable of delivering high-velocity rounds with lethal precision. But the armory did not stop there. Later, forensic analysis would suggest that the brothers were prepared for a sustained engagement. Alongside the 9mm, evidence pointed to the presence of a second firearm, a .40 caliber weapon, adding a heavier layer of firepower to their arsenal. To complement these kinetic tools, they equipped themselves with a taser for close-quarters engagement and a lock knife, perhaps as a final contingency. This was not a hurried reaction to a noise outside, it was a logistical mobilization. They possessed not just the weapons but the tactical accessories to use them effectively, a collection that turned them into a formidable two-man unit. Most individuals, upon realizing they have been detected, would retreat, but the thieves, perhaps emboldened by past successes, or simply unaware of the danger, returned to the car park to finish the job. They expected a quiet extraction of the motorcycles. Instead, they were walking directly into a meticulously planned ambush, orchestrated by two men who had decided that the law was too slow, and that their own brand of immediate Texas-style intervention was the only solution. The stage was set for a confrontation that would irrevocably alter the lives of everyone involved. The communal car park in Cooper Close had settled into an uneasy stillness. To the casual observer, it was a dormant scene, a typical suburban tableau of resting vehicles and shadowed corners. But this tranquility was a deception. Hidden within the darkness, Christopher and Colin Norse were not sleeping. They were lying in wait, vibrating with a specific frequency of anticipation, usually reserved for those about to step off a precipice. They were not trembling with the fear of a homeowner, praying for the police to arrive. They were poised with the focus of hunters who had baited a trap, and were merely waiting for the quarry to step into the frame. As the thieves returned, likely expecting to quietly wheel away the high-performance machines they had targeted earlier, the atmosphere shifted instantaneously. They moved toward the motorcycles, unaware that they had crossed an invisible line into a zone of extreme danger. Christopher Norse did not offer a verbal warning. He did not shout for them to freeze, nor did he discharge a cautionary round into the night sky to signal his presence. Instead, he simply initiated the engagement. The silence of the residential estate was violently deconstructed by the sharp, rhythmic cracking of a 9mm handgun. This was not a hesitant defense. It was a kinetic, overwhelming. Christopher directed his fire, not at the ground or the air, but directly at the intruders. Two projectiles found their mark, impacting Ross Eaglestone in the arm. The sudden eruption of violence sent a shockwave through the group. The thieves, realizing they were not facing a frightened resident but a prepared tactical unit, scrambled in a chaotic retreat. Eaglestone, now sustaining a severe injury, and his associates were forced to flee, realizing the tactical asymmetry of the situation. They had brought bolt cutters to a ballistic exchange. However, the brothers did not cease their activity once the threat had dissipated. The forensic narrative that would later be pieced together revealed a staggering volume of fire. This was not a single panic shot, it was a barrage. Investigators would later recover 15 separate casings from the scene, a quantity that speaks to a sustained and aggressive discharge of weaponry. The rounds did not merely target the thieves. They scattered across the area, lodging themselves into the bodywork of innocent neighbors' vehicles, indifferent to what lay behind them. Evidence suggested a second weapon had joined the chorus. Alongside the 9mm casings, a .40 caliber shell was discovered, indicating that this was likely a dual-shooter scenario. The brothers had turned a residential parking area into a free fire zone, acting with a level of recklessness that transformed a property dispute into a potential mass tragedy. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of the shots faded into the stunned silence of the neighborhood, the thieves were gone, leaving behind only the evidence of their injury. But for the Norse brothers, the adrenaline had not subsided. Realizing that the neighborhood watch approach generally involves far less gunpowder, and perhaps recognizing the gravity of what had just transpired, they made a critical decision. They did not wait for the authorities to explain their actions. Instead, they chose to vanish. The silence following the gunfire was not a peaceful one. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled by flashing blue lights. But in that brief window before the authorities descended, the Norse brothers made a decision that would later baffle investigators. Instead of securing their property and waiting to explain a terrifying home invasion, they chose a path that suggested guilt, far more than fear. Christopher and Colin fled the scene in separate vehicles, driving with a purpose that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with evasion. They headed toward Penge, South London, putting distance between themselves and the smoking brass littered across their driveway. This wasn't a panic drive to a police station, it was a disposal run. Somewhere along that route, likely under the cover of darkness and adrenaline, Christopher discarded the primary weapon, the 9mm handgun. It was shoved unceremoniously under a parked car, a hiding spot that perhaps felt clever in the heat of the moment, but would later prove to be catastrophically simple for a trained search team. Back in Greenhithe, the scene they left behind was chaotic. Police arrived to find a car park that looked less like a theft in progress and more like a small battlefield. 15 bullet casings glinted under the flashlights of the first responders. 2 vehicles, belonging to neighbors who had nothing to do with the feud, were riddled with hallucinant witnesses to the recklessness of the brothers' aim. The air still held the sharp tang of propellant, and the ground was marked by the frantic tire tracks of the fleeing thieves. Then, the story took a turn that defied all criminal logic. Most individuals who have just engaged in a shootout and hidden a firearm would continue their flight, perhaps aiming for a jurisdiction without an extradition treaty, or simply staying hidden until the heat died down. The Norse brothers, however, did the opposite. Whether driven by a strange sense of curiosity, a need to check if their beloved Ducatis were still standing, or perhaps a profound underestimation of modern surveillance, they turned their cars around. They drove back to Greenhithe. They rolled back into Cooper Close not long after the shooting, right as the crime scene tape was being strung up, and forensic officers were beginning to place their yellow markers. It was a tactical blunder of immense proportions, the equivalent of a bank robber returning to the vault to ask if anyone found his sunglasses. The police, already on high alert and locking down the area, watched as 2 men in vehicles pulled up to the cordon. The brothers had returned to the scene of the crime while the investigation was active, effectively delivering themselves into custody. As officers approached, and the handcuffs clicked shut in the cold, early morning air, the reality of their Texas-style justice collided violently with the procedural rigor of the UK legal system. They hadn't just defended their property. They had initiated a complex sequence of events that was now entirely out of their control. And the evidence they thought they had left behind in Penge was about to speak louder than any defense they could conjure. With the Norse brothers securely detained in separate interview rooms, likely contemplating the wisdom of their earlier decisions, the Kent police began the meticulous work of deconstructing the night's events. The crime scene at Cooper Close was less a neighborhood dispute, and more a masterclass in forensic excess. To the trained eye, the environment screamed of an engagement that had far exceeded the boundaries of reasonable force. The first anomaly investigators noted was the sheer volume of ballistic debris. Officers spent hours navigating the tarmac, placing yellow markers next to 15 separate casings. In the context of a property crime, this was not a warning. It was a saturation. The ballistics report arrived with the weight of a gavel strike. The debris wasn't uniform. The majority were 9mm casings, which ballistics experts would soon link directly to the weapon Christopher had so optimistically tucked under a car in Penge. But amidst the 9mm brass lay a crucial outlier, a .40 caliber casing. This singular piece of evidence suggested a second weapon, and by extension, a second active shooter. The police suspected Colin had wielded this heavier caliber, turning the brothers from a homeowner and a guest into a coordinated fire team. However, the true turning point of the investigation, the moment the defense narrative began to fracture irreparably, was microscopic. One of the spent casings found exactly where the brothers had been positioned did not merely carry the residue of propellant. It carried Colin Norse's DNA. In the realm of criminal justice, this is the forensic equivalent of a signed confession. It placed him at the epicenter of the discharge, handling the ammunition or the weapon, in the moments before the chaos ensued. While the physical evidence was being catalogued, a parallel digital investigation was underway. In the modern era, it is nearly impossible to move without leaving an electronic echo, and the Norse brothers had left a deafening one. Detectives accessed the brothers' mobile devices and uncovered what could only be described as a digital archive of obsession. There were images of the motorcycles, certainly, but also communications that hinted at a mindset prepared for violence long before the thieves arrived. They weren't just enthusiasts, they were waiting for an excuse. The automatic number plate recognition, ANPR cameras, provided the final, damning timeline. The data painted a frantic geometric shape across the map of London and Kent. It tracked the two vehicles fleeing Cooper Close immediately after the incident, racing toward South London. It pinpointed their stop in Greenhithe, exact location where the discarded 9mm was recovered, and then, inexplicably, tracked their return to the scene of the crime. It was a loop of illogical behavior that investigators mapped out with incredulity. Back in the interview room, the brothers attempted to weave a narrative of terror. They claimed they were frightened homeowners, protecting their sanctuary from a marauding gang. But the search of their residences told a different story. Police found ammunition matching the .40 caliber casing found at the scene, along with the tactical accessories mentioned earlier. The fear for our lives defense crumbles when the victims are found to be in possession of prohibited ammunition and have a history of visiting tactical ranges to hone their lethal skills. The investigation shifted its focus from a chaotic self-defense shooting to a premeditated ambush. The timeline revealed that the brothers had time to think, time to arm themselves, and time to position themselves in the shadows. They hadn't called for help because they didn't want a rescue, they wanted a confrontation. By the time the Crown Prosecution Service received the file, it was a monolith of evidence: DNA, ballistics, CCTV footage, ANPR tracking, and the undeniable reality of two men who had turned a quiet cul-de-sac into a free fire zone. The trap they had set for the thieves had ultimately snapped shut around themselves. The legal proceedings at Maidstone Crown Court became the final, crushing act of the Norse brothers' tactical drama. What had begun as a fantasy of defending one's castle was now being dissected under the cold, fluorescent lights of the judiciary. The prosecution did not paint a picture of two terrified victims cowering in their home. Instead, they presented a narrative of suburban vigilantes who had decided that the statutes of English law were merely suggestions when compared to the sanctity of their garage. The defense faced an insurmountable challenge. They attempted to frame the intruders as a dangerous, marauding force, which, given Eaglestone's history, was not entirely inaccurate. They argued that Christopher and Colin were simply law-abiding enthusiasts, pushed to the brink by a violation of their sanctuary. However, the timeline was their undoing. The court heard that true fear typically results in a locked door and a call for help. It does not result in two men waiting in the shadows with loaded weapons, initiating an ambush on individuals who were already retreating. The jury was shown the CCTV footage, the forensic maps of the 15 casings, and the undeniable evidence of their trip to the shooting range. It wasn't a panic response. It was a hunting trip. The verdict was swift and devastating. The "it wasn't us" defense collapsed under the weight of DNA evidence and digital tracking. Christopher was found guilty of attempting to end a life, possession of a prohibited weapon, and possession of ammunition without a certificate. Colin, though not the one who fired the shot that struck Eaglestone, was convicted of possessing a firearm with intent to endanger life. In the eyes of the law, they were a single, coordinated unit. Judge Philip Street. John Stevens delivered a sentencing that resonated with the severity of their choices. He noted the disturbing level of planning, and described the act of discharging a volley of rounds in a residential area as lawless and wholly disproportionate. Then came the numbers that would erase their futures. Christopher Norse was handed a 30-year custodial sentence. Colin received 14 years. Together, the brothers were removed from society for a combined total of nearly half a century. The irony of the outcome was bitter. Ross Eaglestone, the career criminal who had initiated the event, and whose resume read like a catalogue of violence, received a sentence of just 3 years and 9 months for his role in the attempted theft. He walked away with a scarred arm and a brief incarceration. The Norse brothers, 2 men who had worked hard and built a life of respectability, lost everything. In the end, the case of the Greenhithe shooting serves as a stark modern parable. It is a story about the dangerous intersection of pride, property, and the law. Christopher and Colin Norse went looking for a tragedy that night. They wanted to protect what was theirs. But in a legal system that prioritizes the safety of a human life, even the life of a criminal over the protection of property, their decision to escalate proved fatal to their freedom. They became a cautionary tale of what happens when the desire for justice bypasses the law and picks up a weapon instead.